Am I ready? Welcome to the Kaysville City Planning Commission for January 24th. We'll start with our first item on the agenda is the opening and approval of the minutes for our December 13th meeting. Does anybody want to make a motion about such minutes? I was not there, so I'm excused.
I wasn't either. I'm trying to get
I don't think I was there either, so.
Oh, wow. Well, okay, then I'll make a motion to approve the minutes of December 13th.
Second.
Josh, you want to vote?
Aye.
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 Motion passes. Number 2, conditional use permit for major home occupation B, tutoring at 375 East, 200 South for Christina Christensen.
Okay, so the application that we're considering at this time is for a home business. The property that you can see there on the map here in front of us on the screen, just off of 200 South. Ms. Christensen, speaking with her, she's looking to work with students a little bit before and possibly a little bit after school for 30 minutes or so at a time. The model of her tutoring is really pretty small, so they'd either be single private one-on-one type instruction or no more than 2 students at a time. So pretty low-key, not large groups, but because it does involve 2 is technically a group, our ordinance requires that there be a limit placed on either the number of students or vehicles transporting them to prevent congestion. Having discussed it with her and based on my perceived concerns, I didn't see anything necessary beyond just placing that required limit. And because it fit with her business model and she was willing to go with it, we were recommending just a limitation of 2, no more than 2 students at any one time. She may be here this evening. I think she had stated to me that her father may attend. I think she had a conflict, but you could ask to see if there's someone to represent, and I'd be happy to ask questions.
Is the applicant here or a representative for Christina Christensen? Okay. So your question about limiting it to 2 students, she didn't have a problem with that?
Yeah, I spoke with her very specifically about that, and she felt that that was fine, that there was no reason why she would ever need more than 2 students. It just doesn't work with the way she does her tutoring.
What about, though, the few minutes between her pickup and drop-off?
And she did state that there typically would be, speaking with her, about 5-10 minutes between sessions. So if she did something at 7 o'clock and one at 7:30 before school, that she would try to put a gap in between it. If you think that's necessary to create a condition for specific spacing, I think that could be appropriate. The area that comes back into the home, it's a little private lane that serves a few homes back there. Gets a little bit tight, but there is some guest parking in addition to the parking that each unit has. And so she felt, based on my recollection of the conversation, that often they're siblings or friends and they're coming together. And so even when there are multiple students, there may just be one car, if they're not walking anyway. So I wasn't personally as concerned about requiring space between, because even if you have the crossover between drop-off and pick-up, it's just pretty small amount of vehicles that are coming back and forth.
Good.
The maximum would be 4 cars, right? 2 coming in and 2
Right.
coming out. Yeah.
And if they are going in that lane, it would get a little congested possibly, but I don't know that it's terrible.
And it's about 100 feet to walk back there from 200 South, too, so it's not very deep,
Drop 'em
where
off.
they could likely leave them at the street.
Well, that seems to be the only issue. Does someone want to propose a condition, or should we go forward without it?
I mean, so the condition would be just the one recommended by staff, right?
For the 2 students, I think.
Right, and then an additional.
Spacing of time or something?
Oh.
I mean, I'm not suggesting we need to. I think that's the only other thing we consider. So,
Well, we either do the condition now or wait for
Problem.
a problem, and then we'd hear about it.
We could make the condition based on cars rather than timing of the lessons. Time the lessons such that there are not any more than 2 cars coming at the same time. Something like that. Because if it's brothers or people that are walking, then that's not an issue.
I mean, I personally would be inclined to just do what staff's recommended, and then if there are problems, we revisit it.
Sounds like a motion.
If I can make that a motion, I will make it a motion. How about that?
So moved. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
Tamara?
Aye.
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 Okay, great. Next is Youth Performing Arts Program at 337 West Paddock Lane for Kelly Richardson.
You skipped one.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yep.
preschool, sorry. So next is preschool at 532 North Richards Ramble Road for Bethany Andrus.
Okay. I'll give a brief introduction, and then Ms. Andrews is here this evening for additional information as requested, or if requested. The property here in the Hill Farms neighborhood on the north end of the subdivision, it's a newer home. They're requesting to do the preschool from their home, and my staff report states they did have a morning class, which you may have found interesting, that it ran from 9 to 11 p.m., but that is 9 to 11 a.m. I don't think the kids last quite that long. And then an afternoon class, typically between noon and 2. So 3 and 4-year-olds, typical preschool ages, Monday through Friday, so weekdays, and then essentially 2 sessions a day, a morning and a PM session with about an hour of space in between each. Having discussed it with the applicant, and then just having looked at the area, you can see on the map, they've got a very long driveway, so there's room for cars both on site, but more likely a 2-hour session, kids are going to get dropped off and then picked up. And where they're across the street from this open area, a little park area of the subdivision, there's a lot of frontage and stuff where cars can stack up without impeding people's driveways or traffic. This is my consideration. So because, again, it's a group, and just based on our pretty standard dealing with preschools, I felt it was appropriate to recommend approval of the use, limiting to groups of no more than 12 students at a time. So again, be happy to take additional questions, and again, they are here this evening if you have questions of them.
Thank you. Shall we bring the applicant up for questions? Are you here? Would you come forward and state your name, please?
I'm Bethany Andrus.
Thank you. I could see your face twist just a little bit when I skipped over you, so I apologize for that.
I wasn't worried.
Okay. Anybody have questions? Anything you'd like to add to what Lyle said?
No, I think that's right. As you can see with my house and my neighbor's driveway, quite a few cars can go just right around that corner and in front of my house without anybody's driveways besides my own being parked in front of. And with the park across the street and then it empties right out onto Angel, it's kind of just an easy straight shot. So, and I've talked to my neighbors. Everybody's fine with it. Right now, most of my kids are just close, walking distance. So.
Okay. So you don't anticipate
No.
every kid having a car?
No.
Okay.
And a lot of them are siblings, so I don't anticipate a problem.
Yeah.
So the picture in here, it's I don't know how the picture is, but is your yard landscaped in, and do they require you have it fenced in any green space or?
So my front yard is landscaped. We haven't been there quite a year yet. So they don't require fencing. We'll landscape it in the spring and summer, the backyard. But kids won't be going outside.
Okay.
So they'll be inside. Since it's just for 2 hours, we'll be in the basement in the finished preschool room.
As far as limiting the number of students, what are you planning on? Are you okay with 12 or under?
Yeah. Yeah, I am currently just doing a little free preschool at my house right now because I couldn't find one that I really loved in Kaysville when we moved here, and it hasn't been a problem at all. So,
Thank you.
Anyone else? Any further discussion?
I think that this is not really a through street, even a minor through street, right? Like it would be one thing if this were, say, Phillips Street, for example. Phillips Street, I think more traffic goes on. This one is not, and so even when there might be some congestion, it's not like the traffic that's on the road is going to compete with any parking if there is a lot, which it doesn't even sound like there will be. So to me, that is not as much of a concern as it would be with something else. With if this were proposed on a more major through street, even though these are all minor, relatively speaking, streets.
Okay, so we'll entertain a motion.
I'll go ahead and make a move that we approve a conditional use permit for major home occupation B preschool for Bethany Andrus at 532 North Richards Ramble Road.
Second.
Aye.
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 Good luck. Okay. Now, conditional use permit for major home occupation B, youth after-school performing arts program for Kelly Richardson at 337 West Paddock Lane.
Okay. The last of our items tonight is with the conditional uses. So another home business, another group type lesson scenario. The property here off of Paddock Lane, just west of the rail trail there, and kind of the south end of the Sunset Drive area, if you're familiar. And the applicant is requesting the approval to hold lessons with children from her home. Typically, groups of about 6 kids would come to the applicant's home to practice ballet or dance or choreography, about 1 to 2 hours at a time, depending on the age group. And she'd have 3 different age groups on weekdays. I'll let her maybe speak a little more to that she's here this evening to give a little more detail. She does work out at Centerpoint Theater. I asked her specifically because occasionally we'll see these where they have recitals or performances, and where she's got access to space to do that elsewhere. Pretty much wouldn't be seen on this property, but did state that they would like the ability on, doesn't even necessarily have plans for it, but the occasion that you want to have a party or something with a larger group than just a typical lesson once or twice a year, the capability of doing that. So based off of that, in my discussion with her, we've recommended approval limiting groups to no more than 10 students at a time. Again, she's thinking maybe closer to 6, but that gives a little bit of leeway in case one group tends to be larger. But also with the ability that a couple times a year, if decided, that they might be able to hold larger activities on the property for the children. So that's the staff's recommended condition. And again, happy to take questions, and they're here to share more information if you would like to hear from them.
Thank you. Okay, the applicant is here. Do you want to have the applicant come up, ask questions? Why don't you come forward if you're here? State your name, please.
I'm Kelly Richardson.
Thank you. Do you have anything you'd like to add before we ask questions, if any?
Just that we're happy to realize what the city is suggested in the report, but more importantly, wanting to honor what our HOA has approved, and we have HOA approval to do that. These are private lessons, and nothing has begun, and just wanted to make sure that everything was on the up and up before we even had a party with our children or anything that might be included in that in any way.
Thank you.
Yeah, I don't have any questions.
I don't either. I think it sounds great.
So how far apart would they be? I think it's in here. Like, similar to questions we asked on the other ones. Are they going to be staggered classes?
I think this is probably one group a day. The
Okay.
HOA has asked that just probably nothing overlapping, nothing. Typically, the city will, I guess in the ordinance, we restrict to either cars or to students or numbers of people. The HOA has asked that their importance be placed on restriction for traffic, and I'm completely happy to do that along with any other thing that they need. If the city likes to restrict on people, we can do that. We can be restricted any which way we would like to. Just wanting to know what's appropriate and applicable in our situation before we did anything.
Great, thank you.
Somebody here.
Okay, we'll take if you'll have a seat, we'll have a few people that comment. This is not open for a public hearing, but we're glad to hear from the public, so.
We'll keep it to just one of us.
Okay.
I don't think you need to hear from everyone. We're not here, in opposition of what.
Sorry, can you state your name?
Yeah, Nate Brower. So I live in the house just to the west of the Richardsons right there. And then across from me is Dan Ames. He's sitting here. The Days next door are out of town, or else I think Amber and Brock would be here. And then next to them are the Dopps, and they're here. And then on the other side of the Richardsons is John Russin, and he's here as well. So there has been, the sign went up on Friday, and there was kind of a flurry of activity in the neighborhood about what the sign was. And so as neighbors, and my first call was to Mike, and we've shared some text. But, we've talked extensively with the HOA, with the neighbors, about the concerns with the traffic, about how can we accommodate their request at the same time, kind of limiting traffic and respecting the neighborhood that's there. And what I'd like to just point to is that they did receive approval from the HOA today in a letter, and I think that letter was sent to at least Mr. Anderson. And so I would just point to that as, and point out that a lot of discussion and conversation went into that approval. And so as you consider appropriate restrictions, kind of take that into account. The restriction there was that be no more than 5 students per day, with 3 classes a week, with drop-off and pickup totaling no more than 10 trips a day. And so that was kind of the, I don't know how best to phrase it, but, that we felt like accommodated their request, but at the same time respected the increased traffic and just helped protect the neighborhood from additional traffic and things like that. So.
Okay, great. Thank you. Anyone else? Okay. We'll open up to the commission.
Matt, do you think it would be appropriate to at least, this is from the HOA, and there is support, so we did receive a letter saying that HOA, even though we don't consider HOAs here, but anyway, so you do have the support from them.
Yeah, and it did go, it looks like it went to the entire commission.
Yeah, I received it as well.
The HOA's approval is a little bit different than what the staff was recommending.
Yeah.
Right.
And
It's more restrictive, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And that's okay for the HOA to be
Yeah.
more restrictive, and we can just, yeah.
Right.
And I think, not just for this, but in the future, yeah, on one hand, as we've always talked, HOAs are a private matter that the city doesn't necessarily get in the middle of. But with respect to a conditional use, we look at the reasonably anticipated detrimental impacts, and then how do we impose conditions to address those potential impacts. And to me, an HOA is better suited than we are to address, to look at what those are and address them. So if I guess what I'm saying is it's good for us to hear what the HOA has looked at, because they're looking at many of the same considerations we are. So I like it with respect to a conditional use to see what an HOA might say.
I agree.
One recommendation, possibly after hearing what was stated from the HOA and what was read. So our ordinance requires that there be a limit on either students or vehicles. You could go with the vehicles and the trip counts. it would essentially be 5 vehicles coming and 5 not, and the number of students, depending on how they're carpooling, things could be different. But anyway, that's our consideration, and of course, beyond that, as you're aware as a commission, you can also do other conditions based on what Commissioner Sunloff has related to those anticipated impacts. So as long as you're at least hitting that minimum requirement that's on the text, you're welcome to massage it as you needed, as long as you can create that nexus of those impacts.
Yeah, even if we were to approve the staff recommendation, the 10 students, they'd still be limited by the HOA requirement anyway. So
Yeah.
I think it's nice to have. We don't get that very often where the HOA comes in and says, "Hey, we've met as an HOA, and this is our thought, our take," and to give the approval with some of their conditions on it. I would agree with Commissioner Sunloff that I like that in this circumstance.
And so I think, just so we're clear, the only really concern we have is traffic, right? Are there other ones that I didn't hear?
Well, didn't the HOA limit the group to 5 students per group?
My guess is that was probably to traffic control.
Just to control
to
traffic?
limit the traffic. So traffic probably is a major concern.
Reading the letter from the HOA, I'm not on the HOA board.
Oh, I can look at it.
I'm the next door neighbor.
Okay. Yeah.
I guess if it were, just kind of throw out the question, if somebody were carpooling, you had 5 cars, but you had 2 students to equal to 10, I think it's more the vehicular traffic versus the number of students, as long as there's a limit set on that as well too. But to me, it's walking kids aren't going to really present a problem as having 10 cars coming through.
That we need to be concerned about it,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. I think that's right.
So what are you saying, that we just follow the HOA's recommendation and limit it to 10 cars?
Sounds like maybe we put a limit on
And
the
5
number of trips,
Number of trips, okay.
but leave the number of students.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'll leave that open.
Yeah,
Okay.
because I don't think the students is the issue.
Because
so.
they had them both in here, so.
And again, they can still make it more restrictive than us.
I see what you're saying.
But to me, it seemed to be more of the traffic issue with vehicular traffic versus the number of students.
Okay.
Josh, Gary, Tamara, who wants to make a motion here?
Okay, I'll make a motion. Hopefully I'll do it correctly. So I make a motion that we grant a conditional use permit for Kelly Richardson at 337 West Paddock Lane, and with the condition that no more than 10 total cars, vehicle trips occur during that time period, the time period that she's teaching.
Yeah.
Is that how I phrase that? Okay.
And then
Or
Would you say per day, if it's going to be one a day?
per day?
So one session per day?
Yeah.
Is that right? Once a day?
Well,
one session,
3 times per week?
So you're saying 5 trips per session? 10 trips per session. Okay. 3 sessions per week. Okay.
and probably
we don't
cap
have-
the students.
Did I have this to the staff?
Yeah.
We would appreciate it for the record.
Okay.
And one clarification I might ask Commissioner Tran on that motion. Perhaps I'll wait for a second. I forget if there was one. I apologize. If no more than 10 trips during that time frame, so if a family member comes or someone who lives there that has no ties to the actual business activity, so if we're regulating that, and I don't know who's driving in and out, so if it could be related to customer visits, or I don't know how you want to term that, but
Students.
I think that that was going to be one of my comments. I promise. It's easier to regulate students than trips.
That's what I was thinking too. Who's going to count the
Yeah,
cars?
it is.
That was, yeah.
Because if there is, let's say hypothetically there is a concern, right? And then staff has to come out and do your own independent verification. And it's a lot easier to say how many students you have versus sit there and wait for the cars to come and go.
Count the
Right.
cars, yeah.
and we can count to 10, but yeah, when you have to verify who the driver is and why
Right,
they're
right,
there.
right.
Time though, you got to sit there for
And the
time.
time.
Right?
But
So-
if the concern really is the impact of vehicles, I mean, you could put 2 or 3 kids per car and limit the number of vehicles, and then your impact wouldn't be great, even if you had double the number of kids.
Even if they walked.
Yeah. So in some ways, we may be limiting. So if if the concern is the number of vehicle trips, but we're going to do it by the number of kids, I'd probably put a higher limit on the number of kids.
With me, it's going to be up to the applicant and the neighbors to really kind of control the cars if it becomes an issue, and all of a sudden they're noticing a large increase of traffic, and if we cap it at 10 kids and there was 10 cars coming in, so there's 20 trips, then obviously that's an issue and a problem.
See, and I think you set the number of kids, and then you assume none of them are carpooling. It's all 1 for 1. And then if they do carpool, then there's less traffic, right? So if you're okay with the number of trips generated by 1 for 1 per kid, then you set that number.
Well, then if that's the case, then probably won't even need to put a limit on numbers or on students if we're doing trips.
No, I was arguing for students.
Oh.
Putting
So then
limit
you know
on-
the max. If you put 10 students, then you know what the max is, and if it's less, that's great.
Right.
So,
But if it's 10 students, then there's 20 trips.
Right. But
So to follow the homeowners association assumption of 5 would be okay, right?
And I don't mean to
That's
take
what
away
they're
your means to say you want to limit vehicles and trips, but just make it customer trips or customer vehicles if that's the route you're going to,
Okay.
because you will find that homeowners or visitors that have nothing to do with the business are coming, and you might be restricting their ability to have the mailman come or something if it gets too specific to just generic trips.
Okay.
So, what was your motion? We can let it fall for lack of a second.
Okay.
And then you can do it again. You can try a new motion.
Okay.
Or
I
we
didn't
can
hear a
vote on
second,
that.
so.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
right.
with students?
So,
Are we more comfortable with
is there a
students?
second on the, let's get this procedure through. So is there a second? Okay, so the motion fails for lack of a second.
Okay.
Want to try again?
Yes, am I trying with
Or
students?
different? Well, I
Or-
think there's a little bit of a division, but
We need the 2 times a year, too, for the party.
Okay.
Oh,
Would this be helpful?
yeah.
Would.
If I may, that's why I think there's wisdom in having both the restriction from the city that was recommended and also the restriction from the HOA. And I'm happy to realize and abide by both. Does that help? There's not anticipated ever 20 trips a day. There might be 1 to 2 students, but just not ever wanting to, it's not going to, the HOA even said 3 days a week. That's not even my intent. So having both restrictions is really a...
you're okay with that?
Yeah.
Okay. So we can put our own restrictions. It doesn't have to coincide.
Whichever one's the most restrictive is the only one that matters, though.
Yeah. And that's probably going to be the homeowners association
honor
rules.
that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
Let me find,
You don't have to do the motion. Gary can do it, or Josh
There
can do
it
it.
is right there.
Will.
oh, okay.
This left side's been kind of
Yeah.
quiet.
Yeah,
All right.
we're letting you guys do the hard work.
Okay, thanks. My laptop wasn't working, so, okay. Okay, I'll make a motion to grant a conditional use permit for a major home occupation B, Youth After School Performing Arts Program for Kelly Richardson at 337 West Paddock Lane, with the condition that, let's see, condition that, oh, there we go, that condition.
There, and then also that right there.
Okay, that we limit it to no more than 5 students per day, 3 days a week, with drop-off and pickup totaling no more than 10 trips a day, no more than 2 times a year,
Well, for larger activities.
for larger activities.
I'll second that.
Aye.
Just a clarification, so that's the same, isn't that essentially the same thing as the HOA requirement?
Yeah, it's the way I read it,
Oh,
it's
two
the
times.
same, except for we have put the condition on no more than 2 times per year for
Yeah,
larger
for the larger
activities.
activity.
So theirs is more restrictive than what the staff, but the way I
Right.
saw that, we were just going with theirs.
You went from 10 down to 5.
Yeah,
right?
I'm actually open to allowing a larger group.
Yeah.
So if that's the case, I would vote no on the motion.
Okay, because of the 5 students.
Yeah.
And I'll vote no.
Well, I guess before the final vote,
I'm
if it
tiebreaker.
dies, what happens?
If the motion dies, you'd make a new motion
Yeah.
until you find one that passes.
Or you can make a friendly
Yeah.
amendment.
So explain to me what you said again, Wilf.
So we had just talked about, and the applicant had talked about, that we would put the city's, what we have, the recommendation essentially, and then there would also be the HOA. And she's fine with working with, within the,
Two different.
the city would give her more flexibility. The HOA is probably a little more restrictive, but she may be able to work something out with the HOA, I think. So I'm
10.
fine giving her a little bit more flexibility than what the HOA allows.
Back to the 10 and the staff is what he's thinking.
Sure. So I'll vote no as well. So now we have a new motion.
Yeah.
Motion.
Well, we
So-
have,
And again, I'll just reiterate. I think the only one that matters, if we're being less restrictive, the only one that matters is the HOA. She has to abide. They have to abide by that.
so let's get something passed.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I think it might be easier for her to work with the HOA and if she gets them to agree, then they wouldn't have to come back here.
So are you thinking,
Change
you're okay with the 10 students, what about on the number of trips? Are you one for
I would
one
just
on
do 10
trips, or
students.
Just
period.
period students.
Just leave it at that.
Not limit the trips?
And then the twice a year for the larger.
Did you vote on that motion,
I
Chair?
voted in favor.
Okay.
And there was
Yeah.
nay, nay,
So
nay.
it was-
So
it
there's
was a
three.
tie
It's
vote
going to be
split.
It's going to, at the best.
vote, though.
Okay,
Sorry.
Tamara.
Oh, aye, because I made the motion.
You don't have to, you can vote against
I
it.
can vote against
Oh,
my
yeah.
own motion.
Oh, sure.
Sometimes you make
I
a
don't know
motion
if that
just to
ever
move things
happened.
along. I want to say this again. Sometimes we make a motion just to move things
You
along.
started the vote.
It
in
happens, you know,
favor.
the people, they
So-
make a motion and then after the discussion, they go, oh, well, that was
For some reason, I thought it went down through,
Okay,
so
I will vote against my motion.
I'll vote against my second, nay. And then
Okay.
we can do a
Fails.
new, I'm glad we had this discussion prior to the vote.
Okay. So let's have another motion.
You've got the info.
This one that
You
will
go
pass.
for it.
I think
Well,
we
beaten up
I think
Tamara's
Wilf's
motion
got
enough.
that one.
Yeah, I'm ready. I'll make a motion to approve a conditional use permit for a major home occupation B, youth after-school performing arts program for Kelly Richardson at 337 West Paddock Lane, with the requirements that the groups be limited to no more than 10 students at a time, with the exception that that allowed two larger activities, or a larger activity twice a year.
I'll second.
Aye.
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 Very good.
I don't think
That
that's
was
ever,
more
I don't think that's
difficult.
ever happened
Really?
before.
That was more difficult than it should have been. But
Yes, it was.
Yes.
we didn't
I'm
take
glad
it
that
like-
was the last item.
Okay. Next is, if I'm not mistaken, a call to the public. Is there anyone here that would like to come before the planning commission? Come on up. Sure, but you have to state your name first.
Jeff Dopp.
Okay, go ahead.
So we just had this conversation about the traffic, and when the staff was talking about the preschool, you were looking at frontage and all that. But when we looked at this one, there was no consideration at all for that in this particular area. I'm just curious as to why that didn't happen. Because in this particular area, there is not a lot of frontage for cars. There just isn't. So our concern is that parking, how are you going to drop off that many kids and that amount of space in front of their house? 10 students.
So
That's the concern.
Well,
So I'm
10
just,
for,
my
10 for
curiosity
timeframe.
is that's been talked about with all of your with what you were talking about before, and then all of a sudden it wasn't an issue on this one. And the thing is on this one, this is actually going to be happening after school, where all of our kids are going to be driving to and from their different activities, where it's actually more of a concern. So I'm just curious how that didn't come up in your conversation on how this was supposed to work.
For me, it was the length of the classes. She said 1 to 2 hours. So I'm assuming that'll be a drop and go kind of thing.
Yeah,
So
3 times a week.
yeah.
Plus the HOA, she still has to comply with the HOA.
Okay.
I think that's why
So
our
you
motion
did-
failed.
The idea was we'll pass the buck to the HOA, and you guys are just okay
It's
with it.
not that we pass the buck, we just are not bound by what the HOA says, but the homeowner may well be, and we'll have to negotiate that with the HOA.
Okay, so, I mean, even if it's a pass, I mean, that's 20 cars.
Well, 10 at a time. You're not going to have, If it's 10 students, you're going to have likely up to 10 cars probably.
Right. How are 10 cars going to fit right there, you tell me?
I see a lot of cars go by on small streets all the time. Doesn't seem to be a big problem.
The other part of this conditional use is that if there's ever a problem,
You can always come back.
You can come to the planning commission, to the staff, and then we can revisit the conditional use, and we can revoke it or we can recondition it.
Okay.
So that's kind of key to this whole process, is that the neighborhood should work it out. If it's not working out, come talk to us, and if it's a problem, then the conditional use can change or be revoked.
Okay. How does that work?
You
Make a
come and talk to,
complaint.
yeah,
Contact
just come
the
and talk to
staff.
Lyle or.
All right, thank you.
Swing by our office and let us know.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, call the public still open. Anyone else like to make a statement? Aaron? Now's your chance to shine. We have a boy from my neighborhood. You decline?
Now you just put them on the spot.
Well, I try to do that. I try to make people feel uncomfortable if I can. Okay, then we'll close the call to the public, and on next to Lyle with reports, correspondence, calendar, other matters.
Okay, so I've got a couple items tonight to share with you. Probably first, an important report. There was some talk about it earlier. So there's some shifting of staff around within our offices. And Anne Marie here has the opportunity to move on to greener pastures within Kaysville City. So she'll still be close. But
Good, as long as you're not going over that other city next to us.
we're keeping her close at hand. So she's the new city recorder.
Oh, wow.
And so you won't see her at planning commission meetings unless we're short and she needs to come back and help out. But
Yeah.
so she'll be doing a great job in a very familiar setting with a different board, so to speak. So
So you're looking for a replacement now? Is that what you're doing?
so we've got a new replacement for Anne Marie that will be starting
Oh, you do already.
next week. Anne Marie starts her new position the first part of February. So
I've kind of already started.
this is her potentially very last meeting here with the planning commission. So.
Well, geez, we're going to miss you. How long? You've been doing this for how long?
15
It
years.
was, yeah, I was going to say, it's been a
Wow.
long time, so.
Yeah.
Long time.
If we'd known this was your last meeting, we would have brought a cake.
Yeah, exactly.
I told Lyle, where's my
Where's my
plaque?
Or we would have tried to make it shorter.
Right.
Hey, but if you're still around, we can get you back. So
Yes.
You've done a great job.
Yeah, we'll miss you.
Try. I like you guys. It's fun to come to your meetings. Banter is fun. It's not as fun as city council. Oh, wait.
He didn't even catch it.
He wasn't paying attention, so.
So that's the most important business, but some other, just a couple items of follow-up, more presentations. So we'll still attempt to keep it short, but you guys make out of this what you want. But we had mentioned last time there were a couple items in particular. One that I mentioned that I had put together from a few meetings past with the discussion of home businesses and the current process we go through for these major home occupations. So currently in-house we deal with all minor home occupations. We have we've licensed them slightly different recently, but about 700 or so home occupations within the city. And Marie will correct me if I'm wrong on these numbers. But specific to majors, there are about 200 of those within Kaysville. And those are the ones we saw 3 tonight. People with customers typically of some fashion that are coming, hair salons, handymen, people that have equipment. And so I put together some numbers just to give you an idea on what you're seeing. I think part of the conversation that spurred this, Commissioner Tran, I'll put you on the spot, but it just brought up, do we need to continue seeing these as a planning commission, probably in short, or are there ways that we can look at these differently, possibly to spend more time during these commission meetings on ordinances or planning or other business? So this doesn't give all the details, but it's a little bit of a reflection of, if you can see here in 2016, I'll be panning around, we had 26 new conditional use permits that were looked at by the Planning Commission that year. You see small engine repair, preschool, estheticians, daycares, dog grooming. 2017 was 34 My numbers are here in the bottom. 2018, we're 32. We've done 7 so far this year. So over the past 3 years, roughly, we've had about 100 different major home occupations that this board has reviewed. And I attempted to group them. Businesses are so unique, as you've seen over the years, that it was a little bit tough to put them all into some spots. But a lot of contractors, that was the number one, 17 out of the 100. They're 17% of the conditional uses that you're looking at with home businesses. Handyman, which is not much different. Their scale of work tends to be so, but very similar categories, another 11%. A lot of estheticians, preschools, group lessons. We saw 3 of those tonight. Massage, swimming lessons, hair salon, daycare. They're all in about the 5% range. Group music and pet care. And then there were about 23 others. I didn't know quite where to fit them into those categories. So it gives you an idea of what you're seeing. I didn't get quite into the detail of what conditions we're putting on them. I could tell you, we talked about the ones this evening when we talked groups. We've kind of, by habit or for whatever reason, tradition, 12 has kind of been a magic number on preschools and group and other things. A lot of that actually relates to a daycare requirement and a restriction from the state. And so we kind of carry that on as a kind of a standard or basis. We've done restrictions with contractors on how they keep their equipment, who can park on the street. Group lessons, we've done similar. I think just a couple meetings ago, we didn't let people park in the cul-de-sac. They had to either park on the driveway or somewhere else to go to that particular business. So I guess, and I may be wrong, so please correct me, Commissioner Tran or others, if there are things here you see that are so repetitive that how we're treating them, that we could make a typical standard and put in a permitted use category that maybe you don't feel is necessary to keep seeing, we can do that with your direction, come back with an ordinance change on how to do that. If you feel kind of looking this and reviewing it, and I think we talked 6 months or a year ago just in general kind of about these, that there's enough quirks with the businesses that maybe 100 over 4 years isn't too much, that it still is worth our time to see them. I think that's the type of direction I'm looking for this evening from you, just in general. Or if you need additional data, if you want to see what the motions have been, maybe to make that decision, let me know, and we can come back with more information to get further direction from you. So I'll pass it that way. I don't know if there's just more questions or directions we can get from you.
I think another interesting thing is, out of all those that we've done, how many of them have come back to us with complaints, or have we re-looked at? The only one I can think of right off the top of my head was more dealing with automotive repair. And we usually set pretty much the same type restrictions on them. Some of them get special circumstances, and usually that's due to the neighbors having concerns or things come out. But I can't think of any other than that one right off the top of my head where, after we've granted a conditional use permit, it's come back to us down the road with complaints and concerns where we've revoked it or changed it. I don't know, can you think of any?
In the time that I've been here, which is not quite 5 years, about 4.5, the one and the same, it's the auto business that I'm thinking about. It's one that has come back. And Marie may have some insight on some that kind of predate that. We do occasionally get calls on items that may not make it to this level of concerns that people are seeing from businesses, that often as we go out and chat with them and make sure they're going back within what they were supposed to be doing. One that comes to mind was a preschool where probably no fault of the business owner, but there was a particular parent that just kept double parking or parking in front of driveways when they would drop off kids. And so just working with the business owner to let them know that was happening, can be cleared up. But yeah, the one in particular is at least my experience with this commission that has come back, and we actually revoked it, and he's been back since with some modifications.
Yeah, that's the only one I can only think of in almost 9 years. So either we're doing it right, doing a good job with it, or neighbors aren't complaining, or they're just deciding to work it out or live with it.
And what I couldn't tell you is if that's because of the process, so because people have to come through here and there's probably some merit to this. They're better informed on what the concerns might be, what the restrictions really are, and what may happen should they not conform. So there could be some reason why the Planning Commission serves as a good tool to, they're not coming back because you guys have either been the vehicle to get them their approval or because you've been the ones to place the conditions on them that we may not have thought about as staff. So that's a hard one to tell and pinpoint on as to why we're not seeing a lot of them come back, or maybe they're just not so problematic that a couple simple rules would take care of them. So,
is it a lot more work for city staff to have it come before the commission?
I wouldn't say it's a great deal of more work. So there's certainly more time putting together reports. I do a little bit more work on these types of businesses than I do on a minor home occupation, which we're processing anyway. There's always a license process behind each one of these, but the additional steps and time, I would say it's not a burden on us as staff to put them here. I think the question that at least I gathered from the commission that I've brought up in the past is it taking away from time you'd rather be doing other things as a planning commission? Sometimes we go through these in just a number of minutes, so 5 minutes, 10 minutes a meeting maybe is not a big deal, but sometimes you have to spin your wheels a little more.
It seemed like one time we talked maybe grouping them or something like that, because I think it's still worth having them go through the process. I think it makes them more responsible when they understand and actually see the process like this. It doesn't take much time. We spend a little bit more time tonight than we typically do on the one, and but I know we talked maybe grouping them and approving them all at once. But I think it's a good process. It doesn't take that much time, and I think it holds them more accountable. That's my thought.
Lyle, I'm wondering if there's a way to group them by traffic that they would create. Because that seems to be the neighbor's number one concern when people want to have home businesses. So, for example, as long as less than 5 cars a day would or something, just some magical number that we can come up with that works. And so, recommend that everything below that number, staff takes care of. And then above it, maybe it could come to planning as a group presentation or something. Would that work?
Yeah, if there's enough consensus. I think there's some on here that are very clearly a hair salon. There's massage. There's a lot of home businesses that really are just one-on-one.
Yeah.
That they probably generate more than 5 cars throughout the day, but there's not going to be more than 1 car at a time for certain of these businesses.
Yeah, or just some gauge it by impact.
So we could potentially group some of those out. And a contractor's one where there's not really a lot of traffic. The concerns tend to be the equipment that comes with it. So maybe it's not too difficult to come up with a requirement as what to do with that equipment, but you got trailers that we've had problems with in the past, at least that I've dealt with on some, or plumbing contractors, employees. So some of those things are not permitted anyway, but they, if they come here before the body and they know what's going on, or if we can get more specific about how to deal with those. So that would be one where they get a little more, they can be a lot more impactful than just the traffic. So we could probably categorize a few that clearly I don't think traffic's an issue, and I could come back with a recommendation certainly on that. I don't know if you have a strong suggestion on what to do with a contractor, if we want to continue to keep those despite, I think traffic is not the primary concern on that one, but there are others. Anne Marie, I don't know if you could hear, just brought up a point that and technically our ordinance already states per home business under the major home occupation B that it's conducted by the inhabitants of the dwelling. So you're not supposed to have outside employees coming in on a major B. But some of these tend to do that with the equipment and trucks and trailers or something they have. They'll have people come and pick them up, and contractors, one of those types. So that, I think our recommendation from staff would be on that one, even though I think the ordinance kind of already deals with it, at least in my mind, but again, coming here before the commission and expressing those concerns and hearing it from a board, sometimes beyond staff, I think can be helpful in reducing and eliminating those problems. But at the same time, we have the right to deal with them through the ordinance if it's in there. So anyway.
So the home occupations that staff currently deals with, the minor home occupations, when you handle those internally, what notice, if any, goes out?
We do not notice anyone on the minor home occupation. And what those are, you have a home office where you're doing paperwork.
Yeah.
You don't have any customers coming. You don't have any employees of any sort. We have another category that, well, they're actually, wink over here for direction if I'm missing one. So you have a minor home occupation, which technically in our ordinance we don't even require to be licensed anymore, based on some statutory changes in the recent years with the state. But if they want a license, we will provide it to them because they essentially create no more impact than a house does on its own. Then you have a major home occupation A, which is highly restricted to the types of businesses that fit in that category. But that's somebody who's working from their home, but they may have one employee that comes and helps them, typically just doing paperwork, office work. I forget the exact language of what's in there. And then you get into the occupation, a major home occupation B, which we see almost every planning commission, and that's where, again, they don't have employees in those scenarios. It's just the residents, but they do have customers, so the hair salon, the preschool, group music lesson, whatever. And then the highest one, which are only allowed in our agricultural zones, is the agricultural home occupation. And that they can have some employees, they can do more impactful work. So we've got the auto repairs, we've got a small engine repair shop that I can think of off the top of my head, and but anyway, they get a few outside employees to bring in with that. So those are the categories.
So my thought is, just my personal view is, the way we have it doesn't need to change, in my opinion, because if we took some of these out of the process of coming before us, then maybe the most important thing is the residents around don't get notified of it, and then they don't have an opportunity to do what happened tonight, which doesn't happen on most of them, but in some cases, people want to know about it and they want to come here and bring up things that maybe we weren't aware of or whatever. And so the majority of those on that list have the potential to create traffic concerns or storage concerns or equipment concerns that can be addressed, if only to just let the other neighbors know that, hey, we're on it, we see it, we recognize it, we impose conditions if we think it's bad, and then they go about their merry way and they know that the city at least looked at it. If we take some of these off the list, then there's no notice to the neighbors, and there's just some uncertainty out there, and maybe enforcement ticks up or something. I don't know. And with the numbers here are so low, 100 over 3 years, really,
and a couple months.
Is relatively low, in my opinion. And if you aggregated the time spent on all of those agenda items for us, it's the smallest part of our time. And for what it accomplishes, I think that small amount of time is worth it. So
I agree. Oh, we didn't take a motion.
And this is one we're just looking for direction, so I don't have a specific ordinance or something in front of you, but if there are some, dare I say, a hair salon that is so run-of-the-mill that you've never passed a condition or that you feel comfortable with that, I'd be happy to come back with something that specifically addresses a few of these, and then you may see a few meetings where you don't have to worry about them at all, or if you just think they all still kind of fit in the same category, go with the status quo. I'm happy with whatever you feel as a commission to go on this, just looking for maybe a unofficial vote, but a consensus type direction. So,
on that, last thing I'll say, on that thing, the hair salon is an example. I think all of us would probably agree, and staff would agree, it's almost a rubber stamp, but the neighbors don't know that, and the other citizens that might care. They might hear hair salon, whoa, what the heck? We got to make sure that, that our concerns are heard or whatever. I know there's not public hearings either for these, but we at least are informal enough where we let people say things. And if we took the hair salon out as an example, then the people just don't get the chance to have their concerns alleviated.
Sure. I'll play just for fun because I like to go back and forth, and I know Commissioner Sunlop does. But one other suggestion with that, and again, I don't know that I'm necessarily advocating for one position or another on this, but I appreciate the conversation. Previous jurisdiction where I worked, daycare as an example, so they didn't do home businesses at all before Planning Commission. It was all done in staff. And on a few, such as a daycare, even though they weren't putting up notice for a public meeting, the applicant was required to send out notice that was given to staff to a certain radius of neighbors. So there was still a notification process despite not going through a public meeting process. So that's just a completely separate idea altogether. If that's the concern, I don't know how we would set up the process right off the top of my head for that, but there are ways to do that if that's what you'd like.
And that would be reasonable to me, but yeah.
But I think what I'm hearing is we're probably okay where we're at from, but
Because the other thing is, we get to hear all of this, and when we come to the general plan, we kind of have some background, and maybe we change the 10 per students to 8, because that's what we've normally done. So I think it gives us a good basis.
Well, and I was just going to say, the reason I suggested it is because it seems like, well, staff's already done their homework in terms of what's allowed and what's appropriate, and most of these tend to be the same thing. We tend to put the same requirements on them, and I was thinking that if there was a way to accelerate that process by not having them have to come, I still think notification would be good, because I know that neighbors do like to know what's going on. So if there was a way to add a notification process for some of them and let staff take care of it, I think that it would free up our time to be more focused on, looking at new zoning ordinances or working on the general plan with city council or stuff like that. That's the reason. Just because, a lot of these, we don't even have questions. And the applicant stands there, and we just kind of smile at them and good luck, and it's great. It's great. They get their time to present, but that's all. That was my point.
And I agree with that, actually, especially if there was some mechanism that if there were things that were going to stay with the staff, that the neighbors were notified, and then they could come to the staff and bring their concerns, and then staff gets to weigh those concerns in their decision, just like we would. And then if they don't, this is another mechanism that probably would never get used, but it might. If they don't agree with what the staff's decision was, there's an appeal process, and the neighbors could appeal what the staff decided. So I'm okay with that.
okay.
We have consensus over here, at least, I think. And I'm sure the rest of them too, but they don't want to see it.
I will work on some ideas with that, and of course you'll have you'll have a recommendation on a final say if we get towards an ordinance. So I'll put together some very detailed processes, not necessarily an ordinance, and have that at a future meeting to look at, and then you could give more direction if you feel comfortable with one of those before I write up an official ordinance, and we'll go through a public hearing process if any one of those options looks more palatable once you see some written details. Okay. It's 8 o'clock, so these are bonus items. You're welcome to stop me at any point. But I wanted to give you an update on this. So the other item that had been brought up was mixed-use development and a consideration of a zoning ordinance for that here in Kaysville City. And a little background on this, kind of where I've had conversation with at least the mayor in particular and a council representative is, I think the city has, I'm gathering from that level of interest in mixed use, but what it looks like, where it goes, what it feels like, what I'm understanding is there's a hope to go through and finish we've got a strategic plan process that we've got an RFP out that we'll be reviewing soon and getting a consultant on board to do some of that, and then we'll be hopefully getting into general plan details this year as well. And so currently that's kind of where it stands, probably with the time frame of moving forward with this. So there's waiting to see what that visioning and public process brings out before we really start drafting ordinances.
Yeah.
The other component of it is the legislature gets more creative with us every year on housing requirements and so forth. So
And the Poly bunch this year.
and this year we suspect there will be several pretty impactful things. So to see what plays out with that, and again address those through an ordinance, and doesn't mean it won't change the next year and the next year after that, but hopefully we'll be pretty well informed by the time we're ready to create one, that we're not changing it and modifying it significantly shortly thereafter. So with that, I just had a few things about what mixed use is, to kind of give you something to think about. A couple examples, maybe take 5-10 minutes. I don't know if you want to dive even into that much discussion, knowing it will likely be down the road before we really get into the weeds of it. But if you're okay with a few minutes of just a little bit of planning lingo and information, I'll dive right into it and wrap it up. Okay. So mixed uses, there's a couple things. I took this out of my old college textbook, tried to forget college already, but the Dictionary of Urbanism. And it talks about their, I'll read it here, so go against the norm and suggested norm of reading from a slide, but it's a mix of complementary uses with a building on a site or within a particular area. Horizontal mixed uses are on different floors of the same building. Places which have a mix of uses are likely to be lively at different times for different reasons, and as different people use or pass through them. Such places will be unpredictable, not monotonous. They will be places where happy accidents happen. They will be versatile. When one activity closes for lunch or for the night or forever, others will continue to provide a sense of security. Investors generally prefer to put their money into development with single uses, regarding them as more straightforward. And planners have tended to specify areas for mixed use, but urban designers point out that mixed uses will flourish only in certain conditions. And the urban designer Kelvin Campbell identified 10 factors he suggested which can help create conditions for mixed use, which are a fine-grained scale of development, diversity of ownership, appropriate tenure, sensitive planning of the process through time, land values that are not excessively high, locations on streets that are sufficiently busy, sufficient density, buildings with flexible form, 9, an interface between two types of building or activity, and 10, positive attitudes towards urban living. So just a couple quick examples of what this is. So this is probably a good example of horizontal mixed use, and there's a little bit of each. But you can see the different colors here on the map. So if you get within a very small or one single development, you have retail, residential with above it, retail with office above it, which is the vertical mixed use, or the horizontal where you just have different buildings of different type, retail, residential, and parking. And you can kind of see them mixed throughout. Again, they tend to be pretty urban the way they go because you're getting more vertical once you start throwing in roof dwellings on top of businesses. That's just kind of a random example of where it's at. This is what you could see from the street.
Sort of an example of this is Farmington Station, except they really haven't mixed in a lot of residential.
Correct. They've got their retail on the floor and the office type environment above it, so they've mixed in there. And so versus you get to a big city where you've got retail on the floor and residents all above it, or office, and it just interchanges, right?
Gateway has that.
Gateway has it.
Offices, residential, and retail.
And so remember, a component of this, and there are probably multiple, and many of you may have more experience on this than I do, so any comments you'd like to add or anything. The residents can help support the business below it, in part. It creates a more urban environment where they don't require vehicle trips every time they leave. They can get to their amenities. They're closer to them, which is good for physical activity and just your general health, but also air quality and items such as that, and it's just the quality of life that some people prefer, different than other preferences. But it also activates the space throughout different times of the day, as was stated. So depending on what's on the ground floor, if it's an office, it's open 9 to 5, but people are living there around the clock, then it keeps the street and areas activated and lively. And that can help improve security, just to create a better sense of place or type of community.
I think a good example, too, besides that, is the junction in Ogden.
Ogden Junction does have it as well. So, yeah, there are a lot of examples. And even here in Kaysville, the horizontal, I guess you could call it. I mean, our general commercial zoning district allows retail and office, and so we get, at least within a commercial spectrum, a variety of uses. And then you'll have a couple areas of town where even you have a house next to a dentist office or something small. So you get a little bit of the horizontal mixed use in some ways, and we can accommodate that under our current ordinances. It looks really spotty on a zoning map, but technically it can do some of the same thing. But what ours would not allow, I assume in this case, is a picture from Alexandria, Virginia, where you've got storefronts and offices on the bottom, but you would have residents or offices above that, so you could get some diversity in uses. And again, you kind of get a little more vertical, traditional type environment. So there are different codes in addition to the mixed use that we could consider to create a specific look or form that could be considered. And I probably won't play it, but just for the sense of time, and a lot of it's just repeat information. This is just something I found as I was listening to different clips and talks regarding mixed use, looking for material for you from the development side of things, where, and I haven't worked in the Salt Lake Valley for a while, it's kind of a buzzword, the mixed use. It sounds fun, and it kind of creates some really neat places. But what they hit on in this a lot is it works only where retail already works or where office already works. So you can introduce housing almost anywhere, but you can't just introduce storefronts anywhere. So you've got to look for those mainly commercial locations that if you want to, in addition to commercial uses, add some rooftops and dwellings, that's where that could work. It gets a little complicated from a developer side and lenders, again, because they like the clean, straightforward, it's either residential or it's office, or that's not necessarily our concern, but that was kind of an interesting notion that I picked up from this. And then from the city side, what I think the way that Kaysville and many jurisdictions in the past have set up zoning, one is to be highly predictable of what the uses will be, to predict impact and how they'll interact with each other. But I think in some ways there's some taxing concerns when you look at it from a municipal level as to what the implications will be on that. So if you allow multiple uses in a property, when it's just general commercial, it's going to be zoned a commercial tax. You have an idea what you're getting, may or may not bring in point of sale or sales tax on it. But if residential is allowed in there, and depending on how your ordinance is written and what actually develops, you may only get residents, which you then lose out on that commercial taxing opportunity. So because of the multiple uses that are potentially allowed within that zone. But there are ways, again, you could create an ordinance that you only get the residents if you provide so many square feet of commercial and so forth. So those are the details we'd have to get into later down the road. But just something to think about. If there are spots in Kaysville, again, it doesn't necessarily have to look like these examples or Manhattan or whatever. I mean, it could be done in any number of ways that are appropriate for our community. But as we move forward in the process, I just wanted to give you an update what that is, likely when we'll be talking about it. If you have examples or ideas or suggestions you want to give in the meantime, so that as we get into those planning processes, we can share those pictures or examples with the community of, hey, here's what our planning commission, maybe we won't put you under the bus, but here's some ideas of what we think could work in Kaysville, and help that through the public process to vet that out. So that's my little intro to it, and if you have any questions, let me know. But that concludes, other than we're meeting Valentine's Day, February the 14th, is the next scheduled or anticipated planning commission. Does everybody have a hot date that night, or will we have a quorum?
I will actually be out of town that week.
I won't be here.
So 2 not, but 4 likely. Okay.
It's a hot date night here.
I should be planning something. Yeah.
You should be planning something. Everybody should be planning something.
That's exactly right.
I'll anticipate that we'll have the meeting unless I hear otherwise that we don't have a quorum or something for the meeting. So.
Do you have any sense of how long the meeting is going to be? What the agenda's like?
I don't know for certain. There are a couple of subdivisions that may be back on that meeting. So,
How about the green property? Is anything? Are they still going to work things out?
A quick update with that. They do have a meeting set up with the neighborhood, or so they're coordinating that for next week. So they are trying to reach out. I've not seen specific details, but here they've got some different ideas and alternatives to run across the neighbors. So that is one that potentially they'll have been given their feedback and be ready to come back in February, and that could be a lengthier item.
Yeah.
Yeah, Wilf and I heard from one of the residents' attorney they've hired,
What'd they say?
and they're meeting with the developers this week.
I believe it's
maybe
Wednesday the
next
coming week.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they're trying to work it out, but it's, escalated a little bit, so.
And we've got a couple, I think I've got a preliminary plat on a large property that we just rezoned the far west end of town. Shouldn't be a lengthy item, but then there's some final plats that could get interesting. So, but the green one, I think, is the one that could make it a lengthy meeting.
Okay. Ready to adjourn? Someone want to move?
So moved.